Let's talk about two brothers. They came from one of the most powerful families in ancient Rome, but they decided to challenge the entire system to help the poor. Now, this isn't some feel-good story. It's a story that ends in riots and bloodshed. Their fight became a massive turning point for Rome, and it all started with one really important question.
Seriously, what happens? What happens when just a handful of people have pretty much everything and almost everyone else has next to nothing? Well, when that gap gets too big, a society can start to crack. And that's exactly the crisis that was pushing the Roman Republic to the absolute brink more than 2,000 years ago.
See, for decades, Rome was almost always at war. And the soldiers fighting these wars weren't professionals like we have today. They were just regular farmers. So they'd have to leave their land for years at a time. When they finally came home, if they came home, their farms were often a wreck, overgrown and bankrupt. They had no choice but to sell their land for cheap just to feed their families.
So who do you think was buying up all this cheap land? You guessed it, the super rich. They started gobbling up these small farms and stitching them together into these gigantic mega estates called latifundia. Just think of them as enormous factory farms. And to make as much money as possible, they didn't hire Roman citizens to work them. They used thousands of enslaved people. This kicked off a huge social crisis.
Okay, so this created a couple of massive problems. First, you had all these thousands of landless, jobless families flooding into the city of Rome. The city became dangerously overcrowded and poor. But second, and for a military machine like Rome, this was a total disaster, the army started to shrink. Back then, you had to own land to be a soldier, so fewer small farmers meant fewer soldiers. The whole republic was kind of rotting from the inside out.
And stepping right into this mess is our first brother, Tiberius Gracchus. Now make no mistake, this guy was an aristocrat. He was part of that wealthy elite. But unlike a lot of his friends, he looked around and saw that Rome was heading for a total collapse. He decided he had to do something to help the common people, even if it meant making some very, very powerful enemies.
So in 1333 BC, Tiberius got himself elected to a really special and powerful position, tribune of the plebs. This job was basically designed to be a champion for ordinary citizens. A tribune could propose new laws directly to the people, and more importantly, they had the power to protect the common folk from the rich and powerful. Tiberius was ready to use every bit of that power.
His big idea was actually pretty straightforward. He dug up an old law that everyone had been ignoring for ages. It said there was a strict limit on how much public land any one person could control. So his plan had 3 steps. First, enforce that old law. Second, take back all the extra land the rich were hoarding. And third, chop it up into small farms and give it back to Rome's poorest families. It was a direct hit on the problem.
The specific land he was going after was called Ager Publicus, which literally just means public land. This was land Rome had won in wars, so technically it belonged to the state, to everyone. What happened over the years is that wealthy families just kind of moved in, took it over, and started using it for free, like it was their own private property. Tiberius basically said, hey, it's time for the people to get their land back.
And this wasn't some vague concept. That old law was super specific. It set the limit at 500 udra. That's about 310 acres per person. Anyone holding more public land than that was, by law, supposed to give it back. I mean, you can just imagine how the senators, many of whom controlled thousands and thousands of acres, felt about that.
The Roman Senate, which was pretty much a fancy club for the richest landowners in the Republic, was absolutely furious. They saw Tiberius's plan for exactly what it was, a direct attack on their money and their power. So they started a smear campaign, telling everyone he was trying to become a tyrant by ignoring them and going straight to the people for support. To stop his law, the Senate got clever. They found a political loophole. They persuaded another tribune, a guy named Octavius, to use his own special power, the veto. You see, in Rome, any one of the 10 tribunes could just say veto, which means I forbid, and kill any proposal instantly. The Senate had turned Tiberius's own powerful office against him.
But Tiberius did something that no one had ever done before. It was totally shocking. He argued that if a tribune goes against what the people want, he's not doing his job. So he did the unthinkable. He held a vote to kick Octavius out of office. And the people did it. This just shattered centuries of political rules and pushed the Senate right over the edge.
The whole conflict came to a bloody, brutal end. When Tiberius decided to run for re-election, which was another break with tradition, his enemies in the Senate started screaming that he was trying to make himself king. On election day,
A mob of senators and their followers literally grabbed wooden clubs and broken pieces of furniture, stormed the public square, and just started attacking. Tiberius and more than 300 of his supporters were beaten to death.
For 10 years, things were quiet. The rich were back in charge, but all the problems, the poverty, the inequality, they were just getting worse. Then, in 123 BC, the movement found a new leader, Tiberius's younger brother, Gaius Gracchus. And Gaius was an even better speaker. He was smarter, and honestly, he was even more radical than his brother. Round 2 was officially on.
Now, Gaius had learned from his brother's mistakes. Where Tiberius really only focused on the one issue of land reform, Gaius had a much bigger vision. He wasn't just trying to fix a single problem. No, he wanted to change the entire system, to shift who really held the power in Rome. And to do that, he planned on building a huge coalition of supporters, one so big that the Senate couldn't possibly break it. His reforms were sweeping, and they were really popular. He passed a grain law that gave cheap food to the poor people in the city. He started huge public works projects like building roads to create jobs. Of course, he brought back his brother's land distribution program. But then he made his boldest and most dangerous move. He proposed giving Roman citizenship to all of Rome's allies across Italy.
This was the exact opening the Senate had been waiting for. They knew this citizenship idea would not be popular. The poor folks in Rome didn't want to share their benefits, like the cheap grain, with millions of new citizens. So the Senate expertly used this fear to drive a wedge between Gaius and his own supporters. They painted him as a guy who cared more about foreigners than he did about them.
With Gaius weakened politically, the Senate went in for the kill. They declared a state of emergency, which was basically their version of martial law. It gave them the power to do whatever they wanted to defend the Republic. They then sent an actual army to hunt down Gaius and his followers. In the battle that followed, thousands were slaughtered. Completely surrounded, with no chance of escape, Gaius ordered his own slave to kill him. The Second Rebellion was over.
After the massacre, the Senate moved fast to erase everything the brothers had fought for. They passed a new law that allowed all those small farmers to sell their new plots of land. And, as you can probably guess, most of them were so poor they were forced to sell, and the wealthy elite bought it all right back up again. The latifundia returned bigger than ever. At first glance, it really seemed like the Gracchi brothers had totally failed.
But their real legacy? It was permanent. Their fight completely broke Roman politics into two warring teams. On one side, you had the populares, politicians who followed the Gracchi's playbook, using the power of the people to force change. And on the other side, you had the optimates, the best men, who defended the traditional power of the Senate and the rich. From this moment on, Roman politics stopped being a debate and became a battle.
So here's the ultimate takeaway. The Gracchi brothers didn't just die. Their struggle, and especially the Senate's violent reaction to it, made political violence normal in Rome. This was the first time Romans had used murder as a tool to settle a political argument. It completely shattered the old rules of the game. It set a terrifying new precedent that would lead to 100 years of civil war, the rise of generals like Julius Caesar, and eventually the death of the Roman Republic itself.
And that leaves us with the big question that historians still argue about today. Were the Gracchi brothers heroes, trying to save the Republic before it tore itself apart from all the inequality? Or were they reckless radicals whose good intentions accidentally lit the match that burned the whole Republic to the ground? There's really no simple answer to that.